All right, thank you. And I'll turn it over to David.
All right. Hello, 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 hello. I'm not promising laser cats, but it's close. And I appreciate the laugh. So for those of you who don't know laser cats, Google SNL laser cats. Um, a little housekeeping. So Miranda Santillo cannot join us today for some personal reasons, but I am told that she will record some responses that will be shared later with the group at a later date. The purpose of this session is to share some examples of how data are being used to guide local strategies to address the racial wealth gap and explore ways partners can support their own communities on this topic. First slide, please. I don't have a premium bowl. All right, so a little bit about me, a little shameless, thank you, plug. My name is David Isiema. I am Research and Content Development Manager at the Black Wealth Data Center. We are funded and founded by Bloomberg Philanthropies Greenwood Initiative to provide data to public and private sector leaders to affect wealth equity. And this is always a surprise to people. It is completely free. We have, I would say, now the largest repository of Black wealth data in the country. So we're always excited for people to leverage that data and use cases and let us know how you're using that data. Super quick, our primary goal is to address the issue of insufficient and inaccessible data on Black wealth. And we've sort of done a couple of projects. I want to give a shout out to Detroit Future City and Data Driven Detroit, as well as the Data Center, Lamar's group. We'd funded them some mini grants at sort of the launch of the center to essentially explore local wealth topics. Data Driven Detroit and Detroit Future City looked at small dollar mortgages, and Lamar's team looked at local wealth estimates. So I want to let the two panelists introduce themselves. So I'm really geeking out right now. So it's very rare that I get to sort of sit on a panel with people whose work I really admire and sort of consume. I like to say that I get paid to read a lot, and I'm always intrigued about the work that they're doing. So I will let Lamar sort of take it from here, introduce himself, and then we'll go into their little mini presentations.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. I am Lamar Gardier, Executive Director of the Data Center, and I'm not 100% sure how much to say right now versus leave for the presentation versus leave for the talk. I
actually don't know what order the slides are in, so.
Okay, it's Alex and then Lamar. So I'm just gonna say hi then, yeah. And pass it over to Alex to really introduce himself, and then we'll go from there. Okay.
Yeah. Then I can see. All right. Yep, they're working on it. All right, cool. Good morning, everyone. I'm Alex Carmardell. I'm with the Atlanta Wealth Building Initiative. First and foremost, our friend Miranda, wish she was here, but I'm just kind of sitting with the fact that there are like 3 Black men at this table to talk about data, in leadership roles in the racial wealth gap space, and that's fairly rare. So I just want to make sure that you all know that, even among the largest, even among large nonprofit think tanks, et cetera, it's a fraction of the industry in terms of folks, professionals working in this field. So I'm just very proud, and I hope it's no mystery to you all that myself, Lamar, and David, we're all partners in this work, and share each other's work and support each other. And so, shout out to y'all. Thank y'all. But yes, I'm Alex Carmardell. I'm with the Atlanta Wealth Building Initiative. We're a nonprofit organization, an intermediary to be more precise, based in Atlanta, Georgia, but working to build the wealth of Black households all across the South. We do this through a multitude of strategies, some of which include capacity building for other organizations, investing in the capacity of other organizations that are serving folks that are capital agitators that are looking to disrupt the capital ecosystem in the South, in Atlanta, and My role is to disrupt Black wealth outcomes through public policy, through data research to influence public policy change. And we do that, we advance policy change at the local level as well as at the state level, primarily. I myself am heavily rooted in local policy and local data analysis. I'm a huge fan of using local neighborhood level data and have been, deeply trained on that. And, I want to give a huge shout out to my partners in Atlanta Neighborhood Nexus, who is in the room. Hey, Tommy. Hey, Nikolai. Who I have partnered with for almost a decade now to help shape narrative and policy outcomes for children and families in Atlanta. I am a recovering funder. I used to work at the Annie Casey Foundation, and we partner with NNIP groups all the time to do neighborhood place-based work, and it has yielded some really impressive outcomes. So just want to, applaud you all that are doing work at the neighborhood level. It really makes a huge difference. But neighborhood data analysis, local data analysis is actually really difficult. It's very hard. There are a lot of concerns, obviously, around data sensitivity, about representativeness, things of that nature. And I, have over time become really frustrated with the lack of available data points to tell a story or depict the circumstances of people of color, and particularly in Atlanta's case, Black households at the street level, to be honest. I'm gonna tell a quick story that leads into the example of, since Miranda's not here, I get a little bit more time. But I'm gonna tell a quick story that depicts how we use local, hyperlocal, I'll use hyperlocal terminology, data to help address racial wealth disparities, primarily leveraging business ownership and entrepreneurship as a wealth-being vehicle, understanding that entrepreneurship is not the sole path to building wealth. It is just one tool in the toolkit. But in Atlanta's case, which grew to notoriety as the Black Mecca and the Black seat of middle-class achievement, through entrepreneurship, through Black business ownership, we recognize it as a significant driver and lever to help build wealth and close the racial wealth divide. So about a year ago, my colleagues and I live in Southwest Atlanta, which is a predominantly Black community in Atlanta. It's very historic, home to the AUC, the Atlanta University Center, several other Black-led institutions, and kind of the seat of Black middle-class communities. And in my neighborhood, a coffee shop called Buzz Coffee House was a place that I would frequent all the time. In fact, it's the place that I really, that I finished my dissertation in. I, was there frequently. I met with community members there. I met the now mayor there on occasion, city council folks. It was really a community hub that generated a lot of action in the neighborhood and inspired a lot of, collaboration among community members. And then, recently in November, my team and I, we wanted to do some work to understand, what are some of the brick and mortar businesses in our neighborhoods facing when it comes to displacement pressures, because we know these neighborhoods that I described earlier as being historically Black are also facing higher rates of displacement on the residential side. But very few people were asking questions around what's happening on the commercial side, what's happening to the businesses here. And so we hit the streets, literally. We went door to door in specific corridors. And of course, because I knew Tremaine, who was the owner of Buzz Coffee House, obviously went there and had a conversation with him. And this was methodology. This was us doing, actual data collection. And in the conversation with Tremaine, we started asking some typical questions around what are you currently paying for rent? And, what do you see as some of the biggest challenges with keeping your space? And at the end of our conversation, he revealed to us that as a result of a 22% increase in his commercial rent, he would be shutting his doors on Monday. And we met on the Saturday before. After a 5-year run in the neighborhood, this was devastating, not just to me, but to many other people who had used that space as a neighborhood hub in the historic Cascade Heights community. And so this prompted a whole slate of new research questions, like an entire investigation around like to what scale is this really an issue? Like, are Black businesses really being pushed out at the same rate as as residents are in the housing space? What are some stories that we can tell to help emphasize the need to keep these businesses in place? And what are some tools that we can create, policy tools in particular, to help preserve affordability for those businesses? And so we developed this policy brief called Standing on Business. Very millennial, Gen Z-esque term here, terminology.
Indeed.
My colleague Jared, who is very much of that generation, came up with the title of this brief, but also very catchy. But the purpose of this brief is to use data to tell the story of the connection between Black businesses and neighborhood well-being, understanding that these are massive assets in these communities. So I won't go through everything here, but this is just a beautifully illustrated depiction of the coffee shop, just telling the story of the closure there. Just for the purposes of this conversation, I want y'all to know that we asked a question, like, Atlanta's known for having so many Black-owned businesses. How many Black-owned businesses are in the city? And like, nobody could really give us that answer. The census does not drill down to the place level or to the city level to give us business owner demographics. And so thankfully, my colleague who worked at the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta suggested, why don't you leverage Dun & Bradstreet data, which who here is familiar with Dun & Bradstreet? Great. So we decided to access Dun & Bradstreet data, D&B data, to get some race-specific information about business owners and basically compile a list of every Black-owned business in the city of Atlanta, within the city limits, because we're only concerned about the city proper. I can get into this later in terms of challenges, but if you've worked with this data set, y'all must know is very expensive to acquire and to maintain. But it was basically the best thing that we could get to help tell this story. And so we had this list of businesses, and then we also, who's familiar with CoStar? Yeah, a few of y'all are familiar with CoStar. So you also had to get residential or property information at the street level, right? So we had to subscribe to CoStar. I'm telling this very raw, like this as a nonprofit, it's very expensive to do this kind of work. And I just want to be very clear about that because I know that philanthropy is here and in the room. But it's so important that we had to acquire this data so that we could tell this story. So essentially, we merged the property data with a focus on small retail spaces, so not office, not manufacturing, retail spaces, which are the predominant type of businesses in these corridors, along with the business data, and we limited the business data to just small businesses that employ 20 or fewer employees, so micro businesses essentially. And with that data, we were able to create or construct a data set to show like where Black businesses are in the neighborhoods and actually map them out and look at how much they may be paying in rent, because obviously those details live in the leases, but we can see what market rent is for the properties and more. And so in that process, we discovered that in majority Black neighborhoods, there was a significant increase in commercial rents over a 10-year period, almost a 98% increase in commercial rent between 2013 and 2023, which is significant in historically Black neighborhoods. But that's not really what the research question was for us. We really wanted to make a case different from what traditional advocates had been making around, like, we need to lower costs, right? I mean, that's a big part of it. But we wanted to tell the story about how vital these businesses are and how much they serve as assets in these communities. And so we came up with an idea to look at child well-being data as a proxy for neighborhood well-being, as a variable to help us measure the relationship between Black business density in neighborhoods and neighborhood well-being. And just for context, the Child Wellbeing Index is owned by United Way of Greater Atlanta, so our local United Way affiliate. Our partners at Neighborhood Nexus helped to develop these measures. And we had child well-being data available for every census tract in the city of Atlanta. We had Black business density for every census tract, and we had the property data. But mostly the business density and the child well-being data are the main variables there. So with those two data points, we were able to estimate a relationship between Black business density and child well-being, which again is a proxy for neighborhood well-being. And we showed that there was a very strong positive correlation between the presence of Black-owned businesses and neighborhood well-being. Now, neighborhood well-being is a culmination of many different indicators, many different factors ranging from employment, income, educational attainment, so many different things. We did not drill down that deep to figure out what specific factors are contributing to this relationship because we just did not have time for all that. But we think it's very powerful to help us make a case in a city that's very committed to doing work at the neighborhood level. We have a very sophisticated neighborhood system in the city of Atlanta. To be able to present this data and show this relationship so that we can garner more support for deeper investments in keeping Black businesses in place. And in our space, in our place, there's really no better way to do that than to articulate that keeping Black businesses in place is good for everybody, and especially for children. And that is why we wanted to do or illustrate this this graph here. I won't go further. I'll hold if anybody has any questions. But I do want to mention that as a result of this work, our city, a day after we released this, had passed legislation that had been sitting kind of in the wings for quite some time to implement a legacy business program, which was one of the first recommendations in our brief. I'm not sure if it's in here, all the recommendations. Well, yeah, it's one of the recommendations in our brief, and the program would allocate $900,000 towards capital improvement or facade improvement, things like that. Drop in the bucket, not nearly what we are looking for from the city to help preserve affordability for these businesses, but it's a start, and we meet with our Economic Development Authority. We were invited, which is very important, to meet with our Economic Development Authority on Monday of next week to advise and support strengthening the legacy business program that they are responsible for now implementing. So very excited about that, and hope that this is a way that we can preserve wealth, shared wealth within neighborhoods. So I'm just very excited about the way that these data points and these findings are helping to accelerate some policy movement, which for me, there was a conversation around impact earlier. For me, that's how we measure impact at scale. Like, we're trying to scale up these solutions, and it's by getting things introduced, it's through structural change, structural reform, which is really the ultimate and only way that we can help close the racial wealth divide. So I will stop and I will pass it to Lamar.
Thank you, Alex. I appreciate that setup. You set me up pretty good.
Yeah.
I'm going to jump straight into the slides if I can. There we go. So this is our team. You all know who we are. As the data center, a data intermediary, just like many of you. I like to show this slide because it shows the actual team below, and I love to acknowledge the folks that actually do the work on our team. I get the pleasure to communicate it, but these are the folks that do it. To Alex's point about who's on stage now, we are proud that in a city that is majority minority, our staff is finally majority minority. That took a long time and a lot of intentionality in terms of recruitment and things like that, where we recruited and how we cultivated talent to make sure that we were matching the demographics of our region. So I do want to acknowledge that and highlight before we jump into it. So last year, we presented this wealth data to this group, and at that point, we were just sort of, we were farther than just getting into it, but not far enough to tell you much about it, other than what might be exciting about it. So I'll just recap really quick some of that. Our work was motivated by the Urban League of Louisiana, who came to us and said, we want to make closing the racial wealth gap our work, our primary work. We want the CEO said, I want this to become my life's work. And so I said, great, that sounds wonderful. I'm happy to work with you on that. But how are we going to do that work? And she said, what you mean? What you talking about? You going to help me? And I said, yeah. We're gonna help you for sure. But just like Alex was saying, so in Alex's example, he had to be astute enough to identify that there was an issue area that needed to be focused on. If he didn't have that insight, that local knowledge, that issue may have not been addressed in any way. It might not have the visibility that it has today. And the CEO wanted that kind of visibility on problems in the region. Where should we put effort in terms of focusing, in terms of closing the racial wealth gap? And so I say, cool, I get what you want, but there's no data to do that. And so no local data to do that. And so we proceeded from that point to think about, okay, how would we approach this problem to help Urban League get a handle on what is a very important issue? And where we landed, eventually, with the help of NNIP and the Blackwell Data Center, who were first to the table in terms of helping to fund this work, we ended up saying, okay, we'll calculate it ourselves, since no one's done it before. And we apply statistical methods from multiple disciplines to develop local wealth data. The methodology, the primary methodology that we use is called Mr. P, or multi-level regression post-stratification, and post-stratification, if you just like being fancy about stuff. So that's the methodology that we used to calculate what the local wealth gap data is on the ground. And I think it's worth saying that all of us spend time looking at individual indicators, right? And those indicators serve as snapshots in time of the conditions in our respective communities and neighborhoods. But how do you combine that into a single calculation that makes sense, right? A single calculation that truly describes the experiences of people, tells us something about whether or not you will be okay if a disaster happens, or if one medical disaster is enough to knock your family out of financial sustainability, financial comfort. How do we measure whether or not people have the ability to thrive? And we landed on wealth as a core way to understand people's ability to thrive, because it combines all of these things together, particularly the way that we've calculated it, combines all of these things together into a single, easy to understand number that takes into account all of the past disadvantages and advantages that folks have had, the discrimination and everything, up to the opportunities that exist today and the good work that we know is going to happen tomorrow. Wealth kind of condenses all of that under a single calculation. I know technically it's assets minus debts, right? That's what it is. But the way that those assets and things formed captures much of this history and the outcomes that we have in our regions. So, sounds cool, right? But what does it tell us that we don't already know? All of you know that stuff that I just showed in the previous slide, and how can we use it to inform work? Well, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a little bit of data and then talk about how it's used, and I'm going to do that over and over again, okay? So here is the actual data, right? Last year I didn't have this for you, but here is the actual data in the New Orleans metro area. Black white households have 13 times the household net worth as black households, and 9 times the median net worth of Hispanic households. And you can see that very clearly in the chart to the upper, that side. 185,000 for white households, 21 for Hispanic, 14,000 for black households. That is the local wealth gap, racial wealth gap in Metro New Orleans, a number that could not be calculated with consistency before. But what's really important about this, and for this discussion in particular, is the way that we've produced this data helps you to fully understand this problem and therefore suggest solutions to it. First of all, the thing that I want to point out first, showing this distribution helps you to understand that the wealth gap is not just a racial issue. If you see, the bottom third of this distribution shows that everybody's in just about the same situation. And that's very helpful to solve this kind of thing because you can't solve it just black folks working alone, right? You have to have multiracial coalitions to solve this kind of work, particularly when it's systemic type work, right? You're going to have to integrate and work with your state, and you're going to find people who are a lot different than who exist within these urban cores, right? So understanding this from in terms of it being a problem that all of us face and that work can be happening on behalf of everyone, that's a really important frame for how you would actually solve these kinds of problems. Then if you move a little further down that distribution, you see once we get to the median, we start to see real separation between white and people of color. Well, that suggests that we have some issues in terms of good jobs, right? Some racial issues in terms of good jobs. These are the middle-class jobs with good benefits and opportunities to advance and things like that. There's an issue in New Orleans there with those jobs being largely white-dominated, right? And so this data shows that very clearly. It's an opportunity for us to put specific effort on ensuring that all folks can get into those good jobs and earn a good wage, a good salary. To the far end of the distribution, this is where you start to see opportunities around business ownership, right? And the huge disparity that exists in New Orleans between white-owned revenue generation and black and Hispanic revenue. There's a massive difference. Like of the businesses that whose ownership can be determined, which is like the businesses that aren't publicly traded, right? Of those businesses, something like 98% of the revenue goes to white-owned businesses. The remaining 2% is split among people of color in the metro area. That is a massive gulf that's demonstrated here in this data. So this data very clearly points to where there are weaknesses across the wealth spectrum. So homeownership, right? Homeownership is the primary way that people in America hold their wealth, right? If you don't own a home, it's all right. Doesn't mean you won't build wealth, but it is a little bit harder to get access to wealth, particularly if you are a person of color. And so this data shows pretty clearly that, yes, you should indeed focus on home ownership, because even though homeowners tend to have more wealth than non-homeowners, white homeowners still have far more wealth than black homeowners, right? So you can point to particular weaknesses and particular difficulty here. And so the Urban League, which their effort is called the Sea Change Collective, the Sea Change Collective then decided to focus on programs that help improve home ownership, self-second programs, advocating for alternative forms of measuring credit, down payment assistance, first-time home buyer education, those sorts of things. But also anti-displacement efforts and remaking the appraiser network, right? Like one of the things that we know is happening here is that even though black folks own homes, and even though that house might be comparable to a white-owned house in another neighborhood, simply the fact that it's black-owned or in a majority black neighborhood will create a different valuation for that house. It's well known, right? But here, now it's shown in the data. So this clearly suggests also, we need to rework the way houses are appraised and valued. And so they've worked to change the way the appraiser network works in terms of who can become an appraiser, how long it takes to do it, and getting a more diverse pool of people into that network. Very directed, targeted action, right? In New Orleans, it also means working to control home insurance costs. You know, we have high homeowners insurance largely because of disasters and such, and also processes around succession. So, also, you know, wealth is a thing that accumulates with age, right? I have more wealth today than I had when I was 21, fortunately, right? And hopefully that's the case for many of us, regardless of your race, right, or any other status. That tends to be the case. Though what this data shows also clearly is that for black folks, that wealth is going to peak around $100,000, for black folks in New Orleans anyway, in Greater New Orleans, that wealth is going to peak at around $100,000 by the age of 65. In New Orleans, white householders surpass that mark by about the age of 35, right, and continue on to peak above 300,000. So that shows a couple of things, right? One, that there is indeed, like how that disparity looks over the life course in terms of both income, like the income that you will generate, how that income changes with age, and the wealth that you will generate and how that wealth changes with age. And if we're understanding that, oops, sorry, I seem to be on the wrong slide here. Uh-oh. Give me 1 second, y'all. One more. All right. So, what this suggests is that you target homeownership programs at young people so that they are able to build wealth earlier in life, and that wealth be something that can be passed down through generations so that young folks are starting off on a better foot. It's not shown here. We're going to show it in future updates of our data, but it also suggests that Black people need better access to retirement accounts and mutual fund stocks and things like that. Some of the white folks in the Louisiana area, at least, are much more invested in those things that help build wealth than their white peers. Than their Black peers. I'm sorry. And then, just a few more slides for you. This is a slide on educational attainment and wealth, right? And you can see very clearly that college graduates tend to be wealthier, as you might imagine. But Black college graduates in Greater New Orleans tend to have only as much wealth as white householders with no college degree, right? A lot of different reasons for why this might be the case. But what it does show pretty clearly is that this issue is not just a matter of socioeconomics, as many people might suggest, right? This is also a great example of how wealth is capturing past inequities into a single number that can be shown. And again, this really helps folks in that conversation about wealth who might just say, oh, it's just a matter of education. If folks just go out and get education, they're going to be fine. They're going to have just as much wealth as anybody else. Just work hard and you can do it. I mean, this data shows pretty clearly that it's not just that. There are some systemic issues that are in the way of those things. And then here's some experimental stuff, y'all. So this is stuff that we only talk about inside the data center right now, right? I'm gonna let you in on it. I hope there are no cameras rolling. So the way that we did this work, it's very flexible in terms of being able to give inputs, feed inputs into the system, and then spit out a wealth number. And we think that this is a great way. This can be a great way for policymakers and others to effectively test their solutions. In other words, if we produce a system that allows you to pull and push levers on specific areas of wealth, and then it tells you how that changes the racial wealth gap, it now gives you a sense of how effective your policy is if you're pulling those levers according to what your policy outcomes were, or what you need to target if what you're trying to do is, for example, close the racial wealth gap by like 2040. So there's one chart to the right here talks about what if you wanted to close household income by 2040. This is how much effort it's going to take every year to do that. And so what we're hoping to do here is give policymakers a way to understand the decisions that they're making and the scale of change required to close the racial wealth gap in their particular cities. This is very much a prototype, just done in Excel, just sort of a proof of concept, but this is where we're heading in terms of a simulation, the ability to do forecasting that makes it clear what pathway you need to walk to close the racial wealth gap. One example that I want to lift up is through our great friends in Milwaukee who are working with us to advance this work around wealth. Their city has an initiative to grow their population to 1 million people, which is great. But growth can be a mixed bag, particularly for people who are who are more disadvantaged, more vulnerable, right? And so, if you are tracking that growth and tracking the wealth gap next to that, in parallel to that growth, this kind of tool can help you to understand whether or not you're growing in the right way, such that you're bringing folks along and that growth is creating opportunities for everybody to prosper. All right, I'm going to leave it there, y'all.
All right, thank you, Lamar and Alex. So I'm going to go rogue a little bit, but not a lot. So Alex, when you were presenting, one of the things that sort of came to mind was sort of the impact of the silver tsunami on Black-owned businesses. I have a lot of feelings about the work that I do, and sometimes a lot of it is that traditional capitalism isn't the right way to go because we're essentially sort of perpetuating the same cycles. So I am curious whether or not you've explored the idea of worker cooperatives as a way of sustaining Black business in Atlanta.
Yeah, before I answer that, just a couple of things. I'm on a neighborhood nexus's board. I'm supposed to mention that. So yes, very important to mention that. You see how like rooted in this I am. And then secondly, to see the data center, Lamar, you talk about diversity. We joked about how 10 years ago I applied for a job at the data center. I did not get hired. So leadership matters. Lamar was not there at the time. This predates him. But really good question around worker co-ops. So Atlanta Wealth Building Initiative prioritizes shared ownership and community wealth building strategies. We do not believe that we need to go out and create a bunch of billionaires and millionaires. That is not our priority. We've seen that you could have a critical mass of Black wealth in the form of billionaires and millionaires in a place like Atlanta, and that wealth just not trickle down. We are not applying trickle down economics to the way that we address the racial wealth divide. And so because of that, shared wealth, shared ownership strategies are the priority strategies for us. So when we talk about business ownership and what's happening to the closure of businesses, we are talking about employee-owned opportunities, transitioning to employee ownership and worker co-ops. One of the programs that my colleague Kim Addy leads currently is a campaign designed to educate business owners about the impending transition they may have to face and how employee ownership and worker co-ops are an opportunity. Where in fact we're building out a capacity building offering that helps build the capacity of business owners and business serving organizations to help guide business owners through the process of transition, of converting, in partnership with Project Equity, which is one of the nation's leading entities focused on this issue and has a Black employee ownership initiative embedded within their organization. And they've now partnered with us in Atlanta to help prioritize that. So it is one of the main ways that we're helping to address kind of the shuttering of businesses, at least through an educational standpoint. From a data standpoint, I will say this, it's really hard to identify like the silver tsunami of Black-owned businesses. In fact, we don't know. One of the challenges or one of the concerns that I have with employee ownership in general is that the efforts often focus on converting, well, let me just say this, 97% of Black-owned businesses are solopreneurs. They don't have employees. And so one of the ways that we're thinking about this differently is identifying businesses that have 50% or more Black employees to ensure that the eventual ownership of the business is a majority Black, makes it a majority Black-owned business. That is very hard to do because we do not know the race and ethnicity of the employees within a workplace unless we go around and canvass every person working in like a micro business or a small business, or we trust the word of the business owner. And those are some things that we're testing out. So, but to answer your question, yes, that is like our chief priority when it comes to supporting these businesses.
I appreciate that. So the Blackwell Data Center has been engaged in some work with the city of New Orleans with the hope that we can convert people who live in severely rent-burdened geographies into homeowners. And that thing that you brought up came up, right? Like insurance rates are 22, 23%. There was actually a recent New York Times article that saw people moving out of home ownership because insurance premiums were making their mortgage rates too high. And so given your geography, what does it look like to sort of, create Black homeowners when they can't necessarily protect that asset?
Man, you didn't leave the
I'm sorry.
softball question for me, did you? No, that's a very a very good and difficult question, right? Because even though unquestionably homeownership is helpful in terms of controlling the cost of your housing and things like that, the absolutely skyrocketing rate of homeowners insurance in New Orleans is a problem. I think importantly, because it is not a problem that is specific to Black people in any way, there are efforts at the state level to try to control and rein in homeowners insurance rates. So I think that that's going to be one of the primary solutions, and it's going to be up to state reps to make clear the different levels of hardship that exists due to burdensome insurance costs, right? So having this kind of data that shows, yeah, everybody is upset about high insurance rates, but some people are not just upset, they're being pushed out, they're being priced out of those things. I think this is where things like collective real estate ownership models may be useful, right? Like being able to leverage the power of the entire group working together to pay for these higher rates. I know a lot of folks in New Orleans are interested in that and investigating what collective real estate ownership looks like. And I think the only thing about the collective real estate model is let's ensure that as you put forth these innovative new ways of people being housed and owning assets, that we structure them in ways such that people are still able to receive the financial benefit of ownership, right? Of being able to build an asset and build wealth. For example, in some models, you own a portion of the real estate collective, but you can't borrow against it. Right? And if you can't borrow against it, then you can't use the equity that you're creating to start a business or deal with an issue that might come up in your life, or borrow money to pay for your kids to go to school or something like that. It's also not inheritable, right? So I'm not able to hand anything down. So as folks are having to find solutions in other parts of New Orleans because the rates are so high, let's ensure that the solution that people go into isn't one that disadvantages them further just because of where they might happen to be on the wealth spectrum.
All right, awesome, thank you. And it's a brilliant answer, despite the fact that it came out of nowhere. The next question I have for both panelists is, why is local data needed in this field? And I'm going to take this other opportunity to give a shameless plug to the Blackwell Data Center. So we recently launched something called a Local Wealth Explorer for Philly, Detroit, and Baltimore that allows people to explore Black business ownership at the census tract level, energy burden, what else? Air pollution, exposure to PM 2.5, and we're hoping to sort of build on this because when we launched, that tended to be the question that people would always ask us. It's like, hey, zip is good, county is good, but can you go lower? And so this is sort of our attempt to get there. So I'm curious, since both of you are sort of steeped in this work, can you talk a little bit about the importance of local data in this work?
Yeah, well, it is for us. We're uncovering some hidden truths that have been often ignored at the local level, at the neighborhood level. And people who live in neighborhoods have questions and want to be involved in what they might be able to do to change the conditions or improve the conditions. But they also need to be equipped with the knowledge around what's the true state of my community. And they can't rely on metro comparisons to do that. I have to remind people, the most popular indicators of what's happening in Atlanta references metropolitan Atlanta. Metropolitan Atlanta is home to, depending on who you ask, between 20 and 40 plus counties and 100 more municipalities. So it is an extremely misleading way to think about what's happening in the city of Atlanta, and even worse to consider how that may trickle down to neighborhoods where we have hyper-local microeconomies depending on the neighborhood that you live in. For us, what it really comes down to is the issue of displacement and economic development, which requires an extremely hyperlocal neighborhood level, like street level understanding of what the trends are in the community. And we're making policy based off of what's happening in neighborhoods. I'll give you one example of our governing structure in Atlanta, which is very unique and very powerful, but we have what's called a neighborhood planning unit system. And our neighborhood planning unit system was invented by Maynard Jackson about 50 years ago in Atlanta, our first black mayor. And it today serves as one of the main ways that residents are able to shape zoning in the city of Atlanta. Like, zoning power lives with residents, which is a tremendous thing, but I mean, you have to have a serious understanding of what's happening in your neighborhood in order to influence change in those NPU meetings. And because one NPU, which is a collection of neighborhoods, is gonna look completely different than the one right next to it because of the way that the city has been broken up, primarily through urban renewal, through the creation of the highways, et cetera. So you have to have that local understanding of, have local data to kind of shape or tell a story and to help paint a picture of trends that are occurring in a neighborhood. Because it's just going to look completely different, depending on where you live. And again, economic development and community development is like the main kind of space or lane that we've seen it be most impactful, because economic development decisions are based on markets. And literally, I mean, a lot of y'all raised your hands because you said you were familiar with CoStar. Like, CoStar tells us exactly how markets are performing in a particular neighborhood. So real estate professionals, other major industry professionals, they use that information. It's like, a lot of people don't know, like, they're heavily informed by data to decide where they're gonna do site selection and where they're gonna place their businesses, where they're gonna import their talent, et cetera. And people, like me and my organization, historically, we've not been as well equipped as those entities to also know what the market is doing at the neighborhood level. So that's kind of exciting. It's kind of scary to know that they've had that level of analysis at their disposal. But I feel a lot more empowered now that we have access to it, although it's very expensive, to help combat the economic development powers that are pushing people out.
Why do we need local data? Because if we don't have local data, the problem doesn't exist. Right? Now, what I mean by that is, let's say, for example, leaders in New Orleans knew for a long time that black men were underemployed in our region, right? You would know that for America, you would know that in Louisiana, and you probably have a feeling that that's true in your city as well. I'm speaking about New Orleans. But it wasn't until the data center published a data point that said that 52% of working age African-American men were not working that people took action. It wasn't until the data was specific to our city that leaders were motivated and felt compelled to do something about it. Now, once we illuminated that data set, city government leapt into action, created an entire department around workforce development, specifically focused on increasing employment for black men. But up until that point, the problem basically didn't exist, right? The other piece is that, okay, the problem exists, but unless we can tell you scale-wise what you need to do to solve that problem, you end up with good work, but not transformative work, right? Not work that is at a scale, a level of scale that allows that problem to actually be solved at the systemic level. And if we don't uncover that at the local level, you never get the kind of effort that's required at scale to solve the issue. In both cases, if the problem is not specifically identified locally and the scale of solution isn't identified locally, it ends up being dismissed as a thing that we're not going to worry about right now, or a thing that is beyond our ability to solve, right? But once there are true numbers put to it, it can't be ignored anymore, and once the scale is illuminated for it, then not solving that problem is a choice. That's your decision at this point. Right? If you now know you need to employ 3,000 more black men a year every year for 20 years, you now know what the number is, and you know what the target is, you know what you have to do to make your city healthy. If you don't do it, it's because you've not chosen to, right? It's not an amorphous problem that you're not sure how to solve, that you aren't sure how much effort is required to solve it anymore, right? And so that local data is the thing that galvanizes action.
I feel like we're almost to the Q&A portion, but I want to sneak one in super quick. Thank you, Leah. So a few weeks ago, we were at the Policy Link Summit, and during a panel discussion, I'm sorry if you missed it, actually, it was amazing. I did a sound bath. Featuring Nicole Hannah-Jones and Isabel Wilkerson. Both talked about the importance of narrative, the former about how the narratives we've been taught leave us unprepared to deal with the American society, and the latter about the importance of narrative nonfiction in helping people understand and empathize with the perspectives of the marginalized. How important is narrative, qualitative data, as an equal partner to data in helping communities not only empathize, but contextualize and support work aimed at closing the racial wealth gap?
I mean, it's for me personally and professionally. All of this work is moot if it's not grounded in the lived experience of people, regardless of background, race, ethnicity. However, it's especially the case when it comes to people of color, or those who have been historically marginalized, because their stories have been superimposed on them, the stories have been told for them, for us, me. And so it's important to always consider how we can support people to tell their own story and shape the narrative. And honestly, a lot of those who have been historically marginalized, pushed out, disinvested in, all the terms, whatever, we're all kind of singing a similar tune. And, it's funny, there's this trend of all black people had the same experience growing up. It may look a little different depending on where you are in the country, but, all our mamas told us the same thing, similar colloquialisms, all of that. Very similar narrative. And it's always important to really, identify where the chorus lives, because that means that they're trying to say something, this community's trying to say something. I was trained as a qualitative methodologist in my doctoral studies. My master's degree is in quant, but let me tell you, it was being a qual studies scholar that made me, it awakened me to how power works in research. We had a conversation about ethics in research earlier. I believe, excuse the controversy, I believe if you are not incorporating qualitative methods into your quantitative work, then it is an anti-ethical practice. And so it may look however you want it to look. It could be, a focus group here and there, calling somebody up, doing an interview, hey, I just want to hear how you feel about this data point. But that is truly how I feel. And a lot of scholars have also written about how we absorb power from communities when we don't incorporate their voices. And so I just really, I don't see any other way. I just don't see any other way to do this work, especially when it comes to the racial wealth divide. I'll give one last example. Whenever we started out on our work, our research and policy agenda development to address racial wealth disparities, something told me deep down, I had a hunch, researchers, we have hunches. I had a hunch that black folks, they're not gonna say it's just assets minus liabilities. That's not what they're gonna define wealth as. And so we did something very basic. We went and hit the streets again. I talk a lot about hitting streets. We talked to people, we convened them, we listened to them, and we asked them how do they define wealth. And a lot of different things came up, the least of which being assets minus liabilities. Money actually had very little to do with how people defined wealth. And the most popular word in the word cloud was freedom. The freedom to care for yourself, the freedom to care for your loved ones, the freedom to take off of work, the freedom to take off work and go vote, the freedom to go see a doctor if you need to, the freedom to live in a community of choice. That was how black folks that we talked to defined wealth. And because of that, our organizational definition of wealth is freedom. It is freedom. And so that's how qualitative narrative shapes our work. It is literally baked into our strategy, our agenda, our policy agenda, our research agenda, and it's unconventional. And what I love about it is that it actually pushes us not to prioritize financial literacy as the main strategy to build wealth, to close the racial wealth gap. And so we finally are able to justify that. So.
I would be remiss, David, if I didn't say that my wife, Ashley Gardier, was helping to lead that session with Isabel Wilkerson and Nicole Hannah-Jones. I'll probably get in trouble if I don't say that. So, but I think Alex is exactly right in terms of what we talk about, the importance of having a qualitative component to understand the nature of the issues that we're talking about, particularly wealth. We found ourselves needing to publish an entirely separate paper on reframing wealth because we saw the bad narratives and the wrong-headed direction that folks would go in the moment you mentioned closing the wealth gap, much less the racial wealth gap, right? And so because the narratives already exist out there, and they're often based on anecdotes or just bad information. When you have quantitative data that shows you something else, you then have to be willing and able to put forth qualitative data that helps reshape the narrative as it exists now, right? So that there is space and room for what the quantitative data is telling you to actually solve that problem without all of the bad anecdotes, false narratives, and just straight out lies getting in the way of what's required to solve the work.
Awesome. All right. Now we will take questions from the audience.
Thank you again, Francisca from Cleveland. I guess just a follow-up question to David's would be, the image is still in my mind, the upside-down triangle that Alex, you showed us, the relationship of small businesses owned by African American employers, and then child well-being, right? So where if there's this causal relationship, it seems like small businesses are driving good outcomes for children when we see them, like at the higher level. But at the same time, on the other end of that triangle, we saw that even in some places where there are fewer small businesses led by African American employers, there were some communities that had high level of child well-being, and I'm wondering, is that a qualitative story where you go in and you look at the resilience? Because we speak of marginalization, but in society, every marginalized group has had to develop incredible resilience, and we kind of not. You don't tell those stories as much, and that's like an asset. Wealth, of course, is an important asset, but that resilience seems to be showing up in your graph.
Yeah, I think there is there are a few stories there, one of which requires an important clarification. So the child well-being data points are not race-specific, so they include all children. And so the resilience you may see in those children that live in neighborhoods that have fewer Black-owned businesses could also be living in more economically resilient communities, which is typically the case, and which is why there are fewer Black-owned businesses there. That is me qualitatively sharing as someone who lives in Atlanta and just kind of knows the way things are. But there is another story that we're exploring as a follow-up here is that there are also a lot of Black-owned businesses in high-income communities, which means or tells us that there is a desire to operate businesses in more economically secure neighborhoods. And for us, it's why not open your business in these neighborhoods that could actually use your investment? And so that's kind of the next step for us. But it makes sense from a more pure kind of, entrepreneurial spirit. Like, you got to go where the money is. If you're a service, goods producing business, you have to go where people are buying the goods. And so those are some nuances that are helping us drive some additional research questions around this. But you're absolutely right.
Hi. Is it on? Oh, I'm good? Okay, good, thanks. You kind of actually partially answered the question that I was going to ask, but I'll follow up maybe for this to get a little bit more depth. Considering like the relationship particularly between retail establishments and consumers spending, and we're talking about closing the wealth gap, that does mean, particularly in the Atlanta context, of bringing in folks who have more money to these businesses. And so based on your conversations, like in the areas that aren't the higher income areas where maybe Black-owned businesses are going to, but rather the historically Black areas that are now being, the demographic shifts that are happening there are changing the consumers that are there. Did you hear from those communities and businesses, like, what were they saying about like the tensions or the opportunities that they saw with those changes?
Yeah, so intuitively, that you would think that would be the case, is that there are more consumers, high-spending consumers moving into these neighborhoods. It's actually a little bit more complicated because we have property owners that are driving out the business owners and then leaving the retail spaces vacant. Same thing happening on the housing side. We have, a highly speculative market both on commercial and the housing side. And so there aren't actually bodies moving into the neighborhoods as quickly as we are just creating more vacant space because we are getting some significant economic development, green space, park space, the Atlanta Beltline, et cetera. It's all displacing people and putting property in the speculative market. So that is something that we had to interview people for to learn, like, what have you all been hearing from your landlords? What are they waiting for? Why aren't they driving up, or why aren't they, preserving affordable, allowing you to renegotiate your lease? These are some of the stories that we've been hearing is the case. We've not talked to landlords or property owners per se, but they have an economic gain in this as well. And if you want to make a lot of money, now's a good time to clear some property around the Beltline. I will say there are, depending on where you live, there's actually there are incentives for property owners to have a space vacant and then recoup dollars from tenants who have had to leave the space. And so there's speculation around what are the motives there that's also coming up. So our hope is that, yes, there is changing demographics in these neighborhoods, and that is going to help more dollars flow to these businesses and help them keep their doors open. But we're finding it's more of a mixed bag, that the vacancy issue is extremely rough because of the speculative market in our community.
Hey y'all, what are some ways that we can continue to incorporate qualitative research methods into our work without risking like over-surveying or over-interviewing community members?
What?
I'm not a qualitative researcher.
David, you have anything to add?
I missed the question. Can you repeat the question?
Incorporating qualitative research without feeling like you're over-surveying, yeah.
Like I think a big tension with going into communities and surveying is making residents feel like you're asking them the same questions about the problems they have and feeling like they're not getting anything out of it. So I just want to know if you have any ideas or advice on how you can sustainably maintain those ways that you ask those questions and include it in your research, because you mentioned that you feel like without those qualitative parts of your research, it adds like such a big element of it, but how can you do that without just asking so many times the same thing, I guess, yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I could take a crack. I haven't actually done it, but I think in the previous panel somebody talked about this idea of data sovereignty, that if people own their narratives, that to some degree they can also determine when you can no longer use and leverage that narrative, or that there is at least a monetary value to that narrative that they also benefit from. But from my experience, I feel like there is a certain richness to a data point when I can see the day in a life of somebody who lives in a particular geography associated with that data point, and sort of sensitive to the potential dimensions of exploitation. That I think that there are ways that we can be intentional about how we collect narratives from communities.
I'll add, so I want to underscore compensation. Like, people don't, I don't mind repeating it if I'm getting paid or if I'm getting fed. And we pay everybody, compensate. There is no grant that we submit that does not include a line item for stipends or full participation in our research. The piece about, I think we're in a unique space in that because we're positioned to talk about racial wealth solutions, we're actually asking questions that a lot of residents have not been asked before. And I'm very careful to investigate, well, what has happened, what has been asked. We support some very hyper-local, like economic development initiatives in our city, and one of the scope of work items was to convene residents and ask them, what do they want out of this space? Like, how do they want to create a space that reflects their needs, and like blah, blah, blah. Well, it turns out for the last 30 years, there have been reports written, there have been surveys done. We simply went to the city and said, just give us all of your existing work so that we can triangulate and make sure that we're not reinventing the wheel, asking the same questions, or taking what's already been revealed as something that people desire, that they want, and then embedding that into the actual recommendations for the space. And you don't have to pay us as much. So it's like making sure that we are leveraging what's already out there, but there is sensitivity around making sure that people don't feel like they're stories are not having a material impact on the conditions in their community, and that's a huge priority for us. We try to tie everything to an actual advocacy agenda, so that whenever you come to us, if your voice is incorporated into a policy recommendation that we publish, you bet your bottom dollar it's going to show up in the form of a draft ordinance, or it's going to end up in an op-ed, or it's going to show up in some form of regulatory, remark or comment. Like, we make sure this is action-based research for us, and so that we're making sure we're embedding this into actual policy. Again, I mentioned my way of measuring impact is through scale, through public policy change. So that's how we're getting around it.
Hey y'all. First off, just wanted to applaud your creativity. Yeah, your creativity in quantifying the issue, and it's really cool data. But when you are in the room talking about these data to someone who potentially has preconceived notions or has those false narratives, or quite frankly are potentially going to say some of the same, racist BS that we all know and hear, how do you go about those conversations? Do you have a positive experience that you'd like to share? Do you potentially have a negative experience in a conversation like that you'd be open to sharing?
Yeah, I can take that one. Because this is what happens all the time. I feel like. And you may have heard me mention that alongside our first publication, we had to publish a paper on reframing wealth. That's the reason why we published it. Because when we started to go into conversations in the beginning, we would start talking, when I say we, I mean the data center along with Urban League and other Sea Change Collective partners. We would go into conversations with folks who were necessary for solving the wealth gap, but who just weren't open to the idea. and we could see people turn off, right? We could see them lose interest and be in their own, back in their own spaces, right? As we're talking about it, which is why, now up front, I'll say, yes, we're talking about closing the racial wealth gap, but what we aren't doing right now is talking about taxation, progressive taxation. This is not a conversation about reparations. This is not a conversation about any of the tactics on either of the sides of the aisle that might be, that you might think about when you think about this issue. And the reason that we aren't talking about it in our conversations, because I'm having local conversations, and the ability to pull any of those levers at the local level simply doesn't exist, right? A city is unlikely to have the ability to do something at scale that could implement a project like reparations, a solution like reparations. That's a state or federal level thing that has to happen, right? And so I will name some of the tensions up front, and then say, that's not what we're talking about today. Today, we are talking about how to make sure that our citizens have a higher quality of life. Everybody, across the board, has a higher quality of life. I'm talking about how we ensure that the crime rates that folks are concerned about decreases. I'm talking about how, when there's another hurricane that comes, how we ensure everybody's able to recover rapidly, quickly from that hurricane, and how we're able to move our economy forward as we grow, as the diversity in our economy continues to increase. How we might think about creating new industries that leverage the skills that are in our communities, such that we get back to growth instead of decline, which is where our population is right now. And once you sort of point out the thing that people in the back of their minds were thinking, it sort of disarms that issue. Particularly if you then say, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about these other quality of life things. It then becomes a lot harder to say you're not pro, opportunity to have a higher quality of life, right? Who says, I don't want those folks to have higher quality of life? Like, nobody's gonna say that. And so you have an opportunity up front to reframe what that conversation is, so that then everything else that you talk about is focused in that space of problem solving, not in the area that you think our conversation is going to be coming from. That's also the reason why I showed that distribution, where it shows that everybody is on the wrong side of the wealth divide. I often don't even call it the racial wealth divide. I just say it's the wealth gap. It's the wealth disparity, wealth divide, whatever you want to say. Because the truth is, even in New Orleans, which is majority black, even in our metro area, which is majority minority, there are still tons of white folks that need help. Across Louisiana, there are more white folks that need help than black folks that need help, right? And so some of that data helps me to lay it out there for people early on that we are talking about benefit for everyone, not just benefit for a few, and not just using some of the tactics that politically you are concerned about. So that's how we headed off early on, and we've learned to do that because we've had the experiences of people short-circuiting the conversation with, negative commentary, negative critique. When we published, it's so funny, when we published the data, there were some haters out there, right? Folks that, tried to poke holes in what we did. At the end of the day, there were folks in the comment section that came to our defense. So we didn't have to jump into it, which was great, because the work was well positioned in terms of solving problems for everybody, and it was rigorously done. And when we do those things, not that folks won't have opposition, but we find that it's much harder to criticize the direction and the purpose of this work when you framed it in the ability to change everybody's life in a positive way.
Yeah, it's really good. I'm gonna be honest with you. Audiences matter a lot, and you have to be a shapeshifter in this work. I really appreciate the data that was shared today out of New Orleans. For me, what it says is that white people are broke too. Like, hello, like, y'all are not making enough money, you know, the wealth, y'all have wealth, y'all have assets, but comparatively to other metros, y'all are like near the bottom as well. I also like to remind folks often, especially you all, that the chasm in ideology from a class perspective between black and white folks in this nation is part of a very sophisticated political project that started, you know, decades ago, and in our context, you know, maybe more popularly recognized as a Southern strategy. And I think there's a lot of work that we can do using like research and data to help dispel the myths that were embedded in the Southern strategy, which pit poor white people against poor black people. And even though it was dubbed the Southern strategy, it expanded across the entire nation. And so it's always really important to name like, this is good for everyone. Like, this work is about building wealth for everyone. Our motto and mantra at AWBI is that we're not just, we're race explicit, but we're not race exclusive. And so we know, and I also want to underscore too, that you hear us talking in more purely black and white terms. To be frank, that's by nature geographically of just where we are, right? And so those demographics are changing though. Atlanta is becoming a more Hispanic, having a growing Hispanic population. Currently, Atlanta is no longer a majority black city. We are a plurality, but we're not the majority. And so the demographics are changing very quickly, and that's going to command a different level of analysis and approach going forward, and different types of criticisms, you know, as it relates to our work. I will say, you know, the economic boost and impact is really what gets people's attention who may typically disagree. I've been working in a conservative policy environment for my entire career. I have sat down with many conservative folks who may not be on the ship when it comes to building wealth or closing the racial wealth gap or doing economic mobility work, what have you, but they are concerned about the general welfare of their constituents and have been able to introduce really powerful and compelling ideas to them and have them take them on and defeat really harmful proposals because we're able to tie it to what's the benefit to their community, which is typically a very rural and disinvested community. And so I do think that's why I say the audience really matters. You know, one example I'll give you in real time is that this past legislative session in Georgia, we introduced the first ever baby bonds legislation in the state, in Georgia. And so part of moving that work forward in the upcoming legislative session, which is our new biennial, is being able to estimate the economic boon to the state to keep workers local, to keep businesses local, to keep homeowners local in these rural places to help garner support across party lines, across ideologies, so that we can actually build wealth across the state of Georgia, not just for black folks. But guess what? It's also gonna cut the racial wealth divide in the state in half. They don't need to know that. They don't need to know that. And so you have to be very, you know, you have to be tactical. You have to be tactical, and that's the environment that we work in. In the South, we've been working in this environment for a very long time. I know it's become very popular recently to not want to talk about race, but that has been our reality for quite some time. And so, you know, we have lessons in the South that can be shared across the nation that I'm, you know, happy to share, and I'm sure others will be too.
Great. Thank you, gentlemen. This is a wonderful panel.